Get out of the car, now. His voice was sharp, cutting through the cold night air like a blade. The woman, calm but visibly uneasy, kept her hands on the steering wheel as she'd been taught to do in situations like this. She asked carefully, "Officer, may I know why I'm being stopped?" "You ask too many questions," he snapped, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. "License and registration. Now." She complied without protest, though her hands trembled slightly as she handed over the documents. It was just another traffic stop, she thought. Just another reminder that in this part of town, people like her were seen as out of place. She'd endured these encounters before. She was prepared for condescension, maybe even veiled insults, but nothing could prepare her for what was about to unfold. The officer glanced at her ID, then back at her. His lips curled into a smirk. "What are you doing out here this late? This isn't your kind of neighborhood." "I was just driving home," she replied evenly, her voice steady but her heart racing. She didn't want to escalate anything. "Not here. Not now." "Step out of the vehicle," he barked again, this time with more force. "Is there a problem?" she asked, trying to keep her composure. "Yeah, there's a problem. I don't like your attitude, and I don't like people like you thinking they can do whatever they want around here." "People like me?" Her question hung in the air, daring him to clarify. But instead of answering, he reached for the door handle and yanked it open. "What are you doing?" she exclaimed, her voice rising in shock as he grabbed her arm and pulled her from the car. "Teaching you a lesson," he muttered under his breath. The woman's mind raced. This wasn't normal. This wasn't protocol. And as he led her away from her car, her instincts screamed that something was very, very wrong. He didn't put her in the squad car. He didn't radio for backup. Instead, he marched her down a dark path toward the desolate railroad tracks that ran behind the industrial area. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of rust and oil, and the faint hum of an approaching train vibrated in the distance. "Officer, this is unnecessary. You're crossing a line," she said, her voice firm but laced with fear. "You think you can talk back to me?" he shot back, his grip tightening on her arm. "You think your fancy words are gonna save you?" He stopped near the tracks, his eyes glinting with a dangerous mix of arrogance and malice. "You see this?" he said, pointing to the rails. "This is where you learn your place." "What are you doing?" she demanded, struggling against his hold. "Shut up," he growled, pulling a length of rope from his belt. "You wanna act tough? Let's see how tough you are when a train's bearing down on you." Her breath hitched as he forced her to sit near the tracks, tying her hands together with alarming speed. "This is insane. You can't do this," she shouted, her voice echoing into the emptiness around them. "I can do whatever I want," he sneered, stepping back to admire his work. "And no one's gonna believe you anyway. A black woman claiming a cop did this? Please. They'll think you made it up." Her heart pounded as she watched him, his smug grin illuminated by the faint glow of the approaching train. The vibration grew stronger, the sound of the train's horn piercing the air. She felt the cold steel of the rails against her legs, and panic surged through her. But she didn't beg. She didn't cry. She locked eyes with him and said, "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." "Is that so?" he mocked. "Let's see if you're still talking big when the train gets here." The horn blared louder. The ground shook. And in that moment, the woman did something he didn't expect. She smiled. It wasn't a smile of defeat. It was something else entirely, something that made his confidence falter. "What the hell are you smiling at?" he barked, stepping closer. "You really have no idea who I am, do you?" she said, her voice calm, almost amused. His brow furrowed, confusion flashing across his face. For the first time, a sliver of doubt crept into his arrogant demeanor. But before he could respond, the train's horn sounded again, and he instinctively stepped back, suddenly aware of how precariously close they were to the tracks. "Untie me," she said, her tone commanding now. "Or I promise, you'll regret this." But he didn't move. He hesitated, torn between the thrill of power and a growing unease. The train's light was visible now, its rumble deafening. And as it drew nearer, the woman's calm gaze never wavered. What happened next would shock everyone, leaving an entire department scrambling to explain, a community demanding justice, and a nation grappling with the fallout. Because what this officer didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the woman tied to those tracks wasn't just anyone. And what she had in store for him would turn his world upside down. Who was she? And what did she do to him that left the entire town in disbelief? Stay tuned to find out. This is a story you don't want to miss. Before we begin this story, we want to take a moment to say this: here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, or any form of injustice. We believe in equality and respect for all, and we support everyone who fights for a world free from prejudice. This story is about resilience, justice, and turning the tables on hate. To all our Black viewers, this story is for you, and we stand with you. Enjoy the story, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories that inspire and empower. Let's dive in. The air was heavy with the crisp chill of an autumn evening in Montrose, a small industrial town tucked away in the heart of the Midwest. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. The quiet hum of factories dominated the town's rhythm, their smokestacks marking the skyline like sentinels of monotony. Life here was predictable, almost stifling, and for most residents, that was just the way they liked it. But beneath the surface of this seemingly tranquil town lay deep divides, unspoken yet palpable in every interaction, every glance. Dan Grayson was a product of Montrose, through and through. A sergeant in the local police department, he was regarded by many as a symbol of authority and tradition, the kind of man who believed in keeping order no matter the cost. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and piercing blue eyes, he was the image of law enforcement etched into the collective consciousness of small-town America. But Dan wasn't just strict, he was selective. His version of justice was tinted by biases so deeply ingrained they felt, to him, like truths. At the precinct, his colleagues saw him as the go-to guy for handling trouble. Trouble, more often than not, meant anyone who didn't fit Montrose's unspoken standard. Dan took pride in his reputation for toughness. It gave him a sense of control, a sense of power. But for the people on the receiving end of his authority, his name carried a weight of fear and resentment. Dan would have told you he didn't care. Respect, he believed, was earned through fear, not understanding. Then there was Maya Brooks. Born and raised in Chicago, Maya was a stark contrast to the rigid predictability of Montrose. A sharp mind and a fierce spirit defined her. She had always been someone who thrived under pressure. At 32, Maya was an investigator for the FBI, specializing in dismantling corruption networks that often thrived in the shadows of smaller towns. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her dark skin and tightly coiled hair a source of pride that some people mistook for defiance. But Maya didn't care. She had long since learned that respect was something you commanded, not requested. Maya wasn't in Montrose by chance. The town's police department had caught the attention of federal investigators after a series of civil rights complaints, most of them involving racial profiling and excessive use of force. The evidence pointed to systemic issues, and while there were several officers under scrutiny, one name came up more often than any other: Sergeant Dan Grayson. Maya was tasked with digging deeper, finding proof of what the surface-level reports only hinted at. It was her job to observe, document, and eventually act. For now, though, she was just another stranger in town, blending into the backdrop. Maya had spent weeks familiarizing herself with Montrose. She rented a small apartment on the quieter side of town and made it a point to frequent the local diner, where overheard conversations often provided more insight than official records ever could. The people of Montrose were polite, in that distant way small-town folk could be, but there was an underlying suspicion that Maya couldn't ignore. It was as if her mere presence disrupted the town's equilibrium, though no one dared to say it outright. She logged these observations meticulously, filing them away as puzzle pieces that might one day complete the bigger picture. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the town in hues of amber and gray, Maya finished her dinner at the diner and headed to her car. Her rental, a nondescript sedan, was parked a few blocks away, and the streets were mostly deserted. She walked with purpose, her boots clicking softly against the pavement, her mind preoccupied with the notes she planned to organize when she got home. Dan was already out on patrol that night. It had been a slow evening, and his patience was wearing thin. He thrived on action, on asserting himself in situations where he could feel in control. The sight of Maya's car caught his attention first. He didn't recognize it, and in a town like Montrose, an unfamiliar car was enough to pique his interest. He followed it discreetly for a while, noting the driver, Maya, who he didn't know by name but had seen around. When she pulled to a stop at a red light, he flicked on his siren. Maya glanced at her rearview mirror, her stomach nodding slightly. She hadn't done anything wrong, but that wasn't always enough. Keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel, she waited for Dan to approach. The interaction began civilly enough, with the usual requests for license and registration. But Dan's tone quickly shifted. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he scanned her documents. "Just heading home," Maya replied evenly, her voice calm but guarded. "This isn't your part of town," he said, his words more accusation than observation. Maya raised an eyebrow but chose not to respond to the bait. "Is there a reason you stopped me, officer?" Dan didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, his gaze cold and calculating. He didn't like the way she spoke, too composed, too sure of herself. It made him feel challenged, though he couldn't articulate why. The conversation devolved quickly from there. Dan's questions became more pointed, his tone harsher. Maya tried to de-escalate, but it was clear he wasn't interested in explanations. The tension reached its peak when Dan ordered her out of the car. Maya hesitated, her instincts screaming that this was more than a routine stop. But she complied, stepping into the cool night air with her hands visible. Dan's grip on her arm was firm as he led her away from the car. "What is this about?" Maya asked, her voice steady but laced with frustration. "You want to play tough," he muttered. "Let's see how tough you are." The distant sound of a train horn broke through the night, and for a fleeting moment, Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. As Dan led her toward the tracks, her mind raced. She didn't know exactly what he intended, but she knew one thing for certain: this was personal. It wasn't about the law. It was about power. Dan, for his part, reveled in the moment. He didn't know who Maya was or why she was in Montrose, but to him, she was just another outsider who needed to be put in her place. What he didn't realize was that his actions would set off a chain of events that would unravel everything he thought he knew about control, power, and justice. For now, though, the night was still, the trains approached a distant rumble, and the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Neither of them knew it yet, but this encounter would change both their lives forever. The cold steel of the train tracks pressed against Maya's skin as she sat in the dirt, her hands bound tightly with rough rope. She could feel the vibrations of the approaching train, still faint but growing stronger with each passing second. Dan stood a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, his expression smug and unbothered. For him, this was a lesson, a demonstration of authority, of power. He had no intention of letting things go too far. Just far enough to make his point. "You're awfully quiet now," Dan said, his voice laced with mockery. "Not so tough when you're sitting there, huh?" Maya's eyes locked on his, her expression unreadable. "You think this makes you strong?" she asked, her tone calm but piercing. "You think this is what power looks like?" Dan smirked, crouching down to her level. Power, he said slowly, is making sure people like you know their place. The word stung, but Maya refused to let him see it. She took a deep breath, her mind working quickly. She couldn't afford to panic. Not now. People like me, she repeated, her voice steady. You mean people who won't bow down to you? People who see through your pathetic need to feel important? Dan's smirk faltered for a moment, his eyes narrowing. He leaned in closer. Careful, he warned. You don't want to make this worse for yourself. Maya tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. What's the plan, Officer Grayson? You gonna leave me here? Hope the train does your dirty work for you? Or are you gonna untie me at the last second, just to show how merciful you are? Dan's jaw tightened. He didn't like how composed she seemed, how she refused to break under his intimidation. It made him uneasy in a way he couldn't quite place. But he shoved the feeling aside, doubling down on his authority. You don't get to ask questions, he snapped. You just sit there and think about what happens when you cross the line. The train horn blared again, closer this time. The sound echoed through the empty industrial area, bouncing off the rusted metal structures that loomed like silent witnesses. Maya could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she didn't let it show. She needed to buy time, to get into his head the way he was trying to get into hers. Do you even hear yourself? She asked, her voice cutting through the tense air. You talk about crossing lines like you're some kind of moral authority. But this? This is nothing but cowardice. Dan's face flushed with anger. You don't know anything about me, he growled. So why don't you save your little speeches? Don't I? Maya countered, her tone sharp. I know exactly who you are. A man so terrified of losing control, he'll do anything to cling to it. Even if it means tying a woman to a set of train tracks in the middle of the night. The words hit their mark. Dan's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he quickly masked it with anger. Shut up, he snapped, standing abruptly. You don't know what you're talking about. But Maya pressed on, her voice steady and relentless. I know enough. Enough to see that this isn't about me. It's about you. About your fear. Your weakness. Dan clenched his fists, turning his back on her as if to escape the weight of her words. But they stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his confidence. He could still hear the train, its rumble growing louder, its horn blaring with an urgency that seemed to mirror the turmoil in his mind. Untie me, Maya said, her voice breaking the silence. Before you do something you can't take back. Dan hesitated, his hand hovering near the handle of his baton. He was in control. He was always in control. So why did it feel like he was losing his grip? You think you're the first person to try and scare me? Maya continued, her tone unwavering. The first person to underestimate me? I've faced men like you my whole life, and let me tell you something, you're not as powerful as you think you are. Dan spun around, his expression a mix of frustration and defiance. You think you're so smart, don't you? He said, his voice rising. You think you can just waltz into my town and, your town? Maya interrupted, her voice sharp. This isn't your town. It belongs to every single person who lives here, no matter what you think of them. And whether you like it or not, the world is changing. People like you don't get to decide who belongs anymore. The train's light came into view now, a bright beacon cutting through the darkness. Dan glanced toward it, the reality of the situation sinking in. He had meant to scare her, to put her in her place. But now, with the train so close, he felt the weight of what he'd done pressing down on him like a vice. Untie me, Maya said again, her voice firm. Right now. Dan stared at her, his mind racing. He could end this. He could walk away and pretend it never happened. But something about the way she looked at him, so calm and sure of herself, made him hesitate. What's it gonna be, Grayson? Maya asked, her eyes locked on his. Are you gonna prove me right? Or are you gonna prove you're not the coward I think you are? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Dan's hands trembled as he reached for the rope, his fingers brushing against the knot. But then he stopped, his gaze flickering between Maya and the approaching train. The sound of the horn was deafening now, the light so bright it cast their shadows long and dark against the ground. Dan took a step back, his chest heaving as he struggled to make a decision. And then, just as the train barreled closer, something shifted in the air, a change so subtle and yet so profound it would set the stage for a moment that would leave everyone stunned. The pieces were falling into place, but the full picture was still just out of reach. Whatever was about to happen next would redefine everything they thought they knew. And neither of them would ever be the same. The horn of the train screamed through the night, drowning out every sound except the pounding of Maya's heartbeat. She could feel the vibration of the tracks intensifying beneath her, the weight of the situation closing in like a vice. Dan stood frozen a few feet away, his hand hovering indecisively near the knot of the rope he had tied. His breath was ragged, his mind racing in chaos. Maya's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding, defying her vulnerable position. Dan, she said firmly, look at me. He hesitated, his eyes darting between her and the blinding light of the oncoming train. It was closer now, the rumble almost unbearable. She repeated, louder this time, look at me. Against his better judgment, he did. Her gaze was unflinching, her expression calm in a way that unnerved him. For the first time that night, she didn't look like someone he had power over. She looked like someone who knew exactly how this was going to end, and it terrified him. You don't want to do this, she said evenly. Not because you're a good person, not because you'll regret it. But because this moment will ruin you. Dan scoffed, though the sound came out weaker than he intended. Ruin me? You don't know a damn thing about me. Maya's lips curled into a faint, almost pitying smile. I know enough, she replied. Enough to know you've already crossed a line you can't come back from. But it's not too late to stop digging yourself deeper. The train was barreling closer now, the horn deafening as it echoed off the surrounding industrial buildings. Dan's hand twitched, the rope within reach. He wanted to move, to act, but the weight of indecision rooted him to the spot. You think you're in control, Maya continued, her voice unwavering even as the vibrations grew stronger. But look at you. You're panicking. You're scared. And you should be. Dan's jaw clenched, his frustration boiling over. Scared of what? You? He shot back, though the words rang hollow even to him. No, she said simply, tilting her head slightly. Not me. Scared of what happens when people see you for what you really are. Her words hit like a sledgehammer, cracking through the carefully constructed walls of Dan's authority. The light of the train cast their faces in sharp relief now, the final seconds ticking away like a countdown. He made a split-second decision, lunging forward and fumbling with the knot. The rope was tight, his fingers clumsy, but he managed to pull it loose just enough to free her wrists. Maya pushed herself back instinctively, rolling away from the tracks just as the train thundered past, its roar swallowing the moment whole. For a second, everything was still. The air felt heavy, electric, charged with the aftermath of what had just happened. Dan staggered back, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. Maya sat on the ground a few feet away, her breathing steady but her gaze locked on him with a piercing intensity. You think that's the end of it? She asked, her voice calm but with an edge sharp enough to cut. You think letting me go changes anything? Dan didn't respond. He couldn't. He stared at her, the reality of his actions sinking in like quicksand. The illusion of control he had clung to so tightly was slipping away, replaced by a dawning realization that chilled him to his core. Maya stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her hands. Her movements were deliberate, almost methodical, as if she were preparing for what came next. Do you know who I am? She asked, her tone quiet but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Dan shook his head slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. No. I don't. Her lips twitched into a faint smile, but there was no warmth in it. You will, she said simply. Reaching into her jacket, she pulled out a sleek black wallet and flipped it open, revealing the unmistakable badge of the FBI. Special Agent Maya Brooks. Dan's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. The sight of the badge hit him like a freight train, obliterating whatever fragile sense of power he had left. He started, but the words failed him. That's right, Maya interrupted, snapping the wallet shut and tucking it back into her pocket. I've been here for weeks. Watching. Listening. Building a case. And tonight? Tonight, you handed me everything I needed. Dan staggered backward, his mind reeling. You can't what? Maya cut him off, her voice rising slightly. Can't hold you accountable. Can't expose you for what you are. Let me tell you something, Dan. This isn't just about me. It's about every person you've ever intimidated, every life you've ever disrupted because you thought no one would hold you to account. Dan shook his head, his voice trembling. You were just what? Maya snapped, stepping closer. Just doing your job. Just teaching me a lesson. Don't insult me, Dan. Don't insult yourself. The weight of her words pressed down on him, crushing the last remnants of his bravado. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze, his chest tightening with something he hadn't felt in years, shame. Maya took a step back, her expression hard but unreadable. You're done, she said simply. You just don't know it yet. As she turned to leave, Dan's voice stopped her. What happens now? He asked, his tone hollow, almost pleading. Maya paused, glancing over her shoulder. Now, she said, her voice cold. Now, you answer for what you've done. And trust me, Dan, you won't like how this ends. The sound of her footsteps faded into the night, leaving Dan alone with the weight of his choices. The echoes of the trains passing lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of how close he had come to a line he could never uncross. And for the first time in his life, Dan Grayson felt powerless. Dan stood there, rooted in place, as the echoes of Maya's footsteps faded into the distance. The cold night air seemed to bite deeper now, wrapping him in a suffocating grip of dread. He looked down at his trembling hands, the faint indentations from the rope still visible against his skin. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his mind racing but unable to latch on to any coherent thought. The distant sound of a car engine snapped him out of his stupor. He turned, seeing the glow of headlights approaching. For a brief moment, he considered running, disappearing into the night, but he knew it was pointless. His world had already begun unraveling. When the car pulled to a stop, Maya stepped out, her calm demeanor unchanged. But this time, she wasn't alone. Another man exited the vehicle, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a no-nonsense expression and an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Dan recognized him immediately, Deputy Director Alan Reeves, a name that carried weight far beyond the confines of Montrose. Reeves walked toward Dan, his steps measured and deliberate. Sergeant Grayson, he said, his voice steady but sharp, like a blade cutting through the tension. We need to talk. Dan swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he replied, this isn't what it looks like. Maya let out a short, humorless laugh, her arms crossed as she leaned casually against the car. Isn't it? She asked, her tone dripping with incredulity. Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what it is, an abuse of power, plain and simple. Dan's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. You don't understand, he said, his voice rising. This wasn't, save it, Reeves interrupted, holding up a hand to silence him. We've heard enough excuses tonight. What I need from you now is the truth. The truth? Dan echoed, his voice faltering. He glanced between Reeves and Maya, his chest tightening with the weight of their scrutiny. The truth is, I didn't mean for it to go that far. Maya straightened, stepping forward, her eyes blazing with fury. Didn't mean for it to go that far, she repeated, her voice sharp and unforgiving. You tied me to train tracks, Dan. What exactly was the line you weren't planning to cross? Dan opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. He looked to Reeves, searching for some semblance of understanding, but the man's expression remained cold and unyielding. You think this is about one night? Reeves asked, his voice low but commanding. This is about a pattern, Grayson. A pattern of behavior that's been allowed to fester under the guise of keeping the peace. And tonight? Tonight, you gave us all the proof we needed to bring it to light. Dan's stomach dropped. He took a step back, shaking his head. You don't know what it's like here, he said, his voice desperate. This town, it's different. You have to be tough, or people walk all over you. Tough? Maya cut in, her voice rising. Is that what you call it? Tough? Because what I saw tonight wasn't toughness. It was fear. Fear of losing the control you've built your entire identity around. Dan's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his frustration bubbling over. You don't know anything about me, he snapped. You don't know what I've had to deal with in this town, the kind of people I've had to deal with. Reeves stepped closer, his presence towering over Dan like a storm cloud. And what about the people who've had to deal with you, he asked, his tone icy. The ones who've been on the receiving end of your so-called toughness? Do you think they'd see you as the hero you claim to be? Dan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The weight of their accusations pressed down on him, suffocating and inescapable. You've made a choice tonight, Reeves continued, his voice unrelenting. A choice that doesn't just reflect on you, it reflects on this department, on this town, and on every officer who wears that badge. And now, you'll face the consequences of that choice. Dan's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He looked at Maya, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? Maya's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Now, she said, the truth comes out. All of it. And you face the justice you've denied so many others. Reeves gestured toward the car. Get in, he said. We'll finish this conversation downtown. Dan hesitated, his feet feeling like lead. He looked back at the tracks, the memory of the train's roar still fresh in his mind. Finally, he nodded and walked toward the car, his movements slow and deliberate. As the car pulled away, the industrial area fell silent once more, the echoes of the night's events lingering like ghosts. Maya watched the taillights disappear, her expression unreadable. She took a deep breath, letting the tension drain from her body, but she knew this was far from over. Back at the precinct, the air was thick with tension as Maya and Reeves led Dan inside. The other officers looked up from their desks, their expressions ranging from confusion to apprehension. Whispers spread like wildfire, but no one dared to speak openly. Reeves addressed the room, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Sergeant Grayson is now under investigation for misconduct, he announced. Effective immediately, he is relieved of his duties. Any questions can be directed to me. The room fell silent, the shock of his words reverberating through the air. Dan stood motionless, his face pale, as two officers approached to escort him to an interrogation room. Maya watched as he disappeared down the hallway, her mind already racing with the next steps. Reeves turned to her, his expression unreadable. You did good tonight, he said, his voice quieter now. But this is just the beginning. Maya nodded, her jaw set with determination. I know, she said. And I'm ready. As the night wore on, the pieces of Dan's carefully constructed world began to crumble, one revelation at a time. And for Maya, it was just another step toward justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced for far too long. The precinct was unusually quiet in the early hours of the morning. A subdued tension hung in the air, thick and oppressive, as though the building itself was bracing for the fallout. Maya sat at a desk in a private room, her hands resting on the cool surface as she reviewed her notes. The events of the night were still fresh, each detail burned into her memory with vivid clarity. She wasn't just piecing together the narrative for a report, she was preparing for what would come next. Across the hall, Dan Grayson sat in an interrogation room, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the lines etched into his skin by years of stress and frustration. He stared at the empty chair across from him, his mind racing with scenarios, excuses, and denials. But the weight of reality pressed down on him like a boulder, immovable and inescapable. When the door opened, Dan barely flinched. Reeves stepped inside, followed by Maya, who carried a thick folder tucked under her arm. She took a seat opposite Dan, her movements deliberate, while Reeves leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, watching silently. Maya placed the folder on the table, opening it slowly to reveal a series of documents, photographs, and printed reports. She flipped through the contents methodically, her expression calm but unreadable. "Sergeant Grayson," she began, her tone formal, "let's get straight to the point. This isn't just about tonight. Tonight was the culmination of something much bigger, a pattern of behavior that we've been tracking for months." Dan stiffened, his jaw clenching. "You're trying to paint me as a monster," he said, his voice defensive. "But I was doing my job. Keeping order. Protecting this town." Maya met his gaze, her eyes sharp and unwavering. "Protecting who, exactly?" she countered. "Because it certainly wasn't everyone in this town. In fact, based on the evidence we've gathered, it's clear that your idea of protection was selective at best, and downright malicious at worst." She slid a photograph across the table. It showed a young black man, his face bruised and swollen. "Do you recognize him?" Dan's eyes flickered to the photo, but he quickly looked away. "I don't remember every person I've encountered," he muttered. Maya leaned forward, her voice low but firm. "His name is Marcus Holloway. Last year, you pulled him over for a broken taillight. What started as a routine traffic stop ended with him in the hospital, and you filing a report that conveniently left out the part where you used excessive force." "That's not how it happened," Dan protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Really?" Maya said, arching an eyebrow. She pulled out a second document and placed it beside the photo. "Because we have witness statements that tell a very different story. Not to mention dashcam footage that mysteriously went missing after the incident." Dan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushing with anger and shame. "I did what I had to do," he said through gritted teeth. He was resisting. "Resisting?" Maya repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. "Resisting what? Being treated like a criminal for something as minor as a broken taillight?" Reeves finally spoke, his voice calm but authoritative. "This isn't just about one case, Grayson. We have a list. Names, dates, incidents. And your name comes up far too often for this to be a coincidence." Dan looked between them, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and defiance. "You don't understand what it's like out there," he said, his voice rising. "People don't respect the law anymore. They push back, they challenge you at every turn. If you're not tough, they'll walk all over you." Maya's expression darkened, her voice cutting through his justification like a knife. "Toughness isn't abusing your authority. Toughness is doing your job with integrity, even when it's hard. What you've been doing isn't toughness, it's cowardice." Dan's mouth opened, but no words came out. He slumped back in his chair, the fight draining out of him. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the full scope of what he was facing. Reeves stepped forward, placing a hand on the table as he addressed Dan directly. "You have two options," he said. "You can cooperate with this investigation, come clean about everything, and maybe salvage what little integrity you have left. Or you can dig your heels in, deny everything, and let us bury you with the evidence we already have. The choice is yours." The room fell silent, the weight of the ultimatum hanging heavy in the air. Dan stared at the table, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He thought of his career, his reputation, the life he had built around the badge he now realized was a symbol of something far darker than he had ever admitted to himself. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happens if I cooperate?" Maya leaned back in her chair, her expression softening slightly. "You tell the truth," she said. "All of it. Not just about yourself, but about anyone else in the department who's been complicit in this. You help us root out the corruption, and in return, we'll consider leniency in how your case is handled." Dan looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "And if I don't?" Reeves answered, his voice cold and firm. "Then you face the full weight of the justice system. And trust me, Grayson, it will crush you." The words hung in the air like a death knell. Dan closed his eyes, his shoulders sagging as the enormity of his situation finally sank in. For the first time in years, he felt small, powerless. The very thing he had fought so hard to avoid. "I'll cooperate," he said finally, his voice trembling. "I'll tell you everything." Maya and Reeves exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Maya stood, gathering the documents from the table. "Good," she said simply. "But let me be clear, Dan, this doesn't erase what you've done. It's just the beginning of making it right." As she and Reeves left the room, Dan was left alone with his thoughts, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like never before. He knew the road ahead would be long and grueling, but for the first time, he began to see the faint glimmer of a path forward, one that might lead to redemption, if he was willing to take it. The room was suffocatingly silent after Maya and Reeves left. Dan sat alone at the cold metal table, his head in his hands, the reality of his decision sinking in like a lead weight. Cooperating meant more than just admitting his own wrongdoing, it meant turning against the very system he had been a part of, exposing the corruption he had once believed was necessary to maintain order. It was a betrayal of the unspoken code he'd followed for years, but he knew there was no other way out. The door opened, breaking his thoughts. A younger officer stepped inside, his expression hesitant. "Sergeant Grayson," he said quietly, "they want you to start writing your statement." Dan looked up, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. He nodded slowly, standing with effort as though the act of moving took every ounce of strength he had left. The officer led him to a smaller office with a desk, a chair, and a stack of blank forms waiting for his confession. Dan sat down, picking up the pen with a shaky hand. The first words felt like trying to push a boulder uphill. "I abused my authority." The pen hovered over the page as he hesitated, the enormity of the truth clawing at his chest. He forced himself to keep writing, each word cutting deeper as he chronicled years of decisions he could no longer justify. The minutes stretched into hours as Dan filled page after page, his handwriting deteriorating as his emotions overtook him. Anger, guilt, and shame swirled inside him like a storm, each memory dredging up feelings he had long buried. He thought of Marcus Holloway, the young man from the photo. He thought of the countless others who had been on the receiving end of his misplaced rage and arrogance. Their faces blurred together, a haunting mosaic of the pain he had inflicted. When he finally set the pen down, his hands were trembling. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the stack of papers in front of him, knowing they represented a lifetime of mistakes. For the first time, he didn't try to justify or excuse them. He simply accepted them for what they were, a record of his failures. The door opened again, and Maya stepped inside, followed by Reeves. Maya glanced at the papers, her expression unreadable as she flipped through them. She took a seat across from Dan, the tension between them palpable. "Is it all there?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Dan nodded, his voice hoarse. "Everything I could remember." Maya studied him for a moment, as though trying to determine whether he was being truthful. Finally, she set the papers aside and leaned forward slightly. "Why now, Dan?" she asked. "Why decide to cooperate after all these years of looking the other way?" Dan hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. "Because I can't live with it anymore," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent years telling myself I was doing the right thing, that I was keeping this town safe. But all I've done is hurt people. People who didn't deserve it." Maya's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained measured. "And what about the people who helped you? The ones who encouraged this behavior, turned a blind eye, or even participated in it? Are you ready to name them?" Dan's stomach twisted at the question. He knew what she was asking, and he knew what it would cost him. Loyalty among officers was deeply ingrained, and breaking that unspoken bond would make him a pariah. But he also knew that staying silent would only perpetuate the cycle of corruption. "I'll tell you everything," he said finally, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "Names, dates, everything I know." Maya nodded, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of respect and skepticism. "Good," she said. "But understand this, Dan, cooperating doesn't make you a hero. It doesn't undo the harm you've caused. It's just the first step toward accountability." Dan nodded, swallowing hard. "I know," he said quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to make it right." Reeves, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Making it right starts with telling the truth. But it doesn't end there. You're going to have to face the consequences, Grayson. Every single one of them." Dan nodded again, his shoulders slumping under the weight of their words. He knew they were right. This wasn't about redemption, it was about taking responsibility for the damage he had done. Over the next several days, Dan worked closely with Maya and Reeves, providing detailed accounts of the systemic corruption within the department. He named names, described incidents, and handed over evidence he had once kept hidden. Each revelation felt like ripping open an old wound, but he forced himself to push through it. The atmosphere at the precinct was tense as word of the investigation spread. Some officers avoided Dan entirely, their disdain palpable. Others confronted him directly, their anger boiling over in heated exchanges. "You're a disgrace," one officer spat at him in the locker room, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think cooperating is gonna save you? All you've done is drag the rest of us down with you." Dan didn't respond. He didn't defend himself or argue. He simply shouldered the insults, knowing they were a small price to pay for the harm he had caused. Maya, meanwhile, found herself grappling with her own emotions. She had worked cases like this before, but something about Dan's transformation left her conflicted. She didn't trust him entirely, how could she, after everything he had done? But she also couldn't ignore the fact that he was trying, in his own flawed way, to make amends. One evening, as they sat in a conference room reviewing evidence, Maya finally broke the silence. "Why now, Dan?" she asked again, her voice quieter this time. "Why not years ago, when you first saw how broken the system was?" Dan looked at her, his expression weary. "Because I was too afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of losing my job, my reputation, everything I thought defined me. I didn't want to admit that I was part of the problem. But after what happened that night, I couldn't lie to myself anymore." Maya studied him, her expression thoughtful. "Fear can make people do terrible things," she said. "But it can also push them to change. The question is, are you ready to follow through on this? Or is this just another way to protect yourself?" Dan met her gaze, his voice steady. "I don't care about protecting myself anymore," he said. "I just want to do what's right." Maya nodded slowly, her respect for him growing incrementally, though she still held him at arm's length. She knew there was no such thing as a clean slate, but she also believed in the power of accountability to spark change, even in the most unlikely places. As the investigation progressed, the walls around Dan's former life continued to crumble. And with each revelation, Maya felt the pieces of a larger truth falling into place, setting the stage for a resolution that would leave no room for ambiguity. The days stretched into weeks as the investigation into the Montrose Police Department gained momentum. Dan became a key player in uncovering the layers of corruption that had taken root over decades, his testimony unraveling the stories of cover-ups, excessive force, and a culture that thrived on intimidation and impunity. Each day brought a new revelation, and with it, a new fracture in the department's carefully constructed facade. Maya spent long hours poring over reports, compiling evidence, and conducting interviews with those who had been victimized by the system. She worked tirelessly, but the weight of the stories she uncovered pressed heavily on her. Every statement she took, every piece of evidence she logged, carried the echoes of pain and injustice that had been ignored for far too long. Late one evening, Maya sat in her temporary office, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating the darkened room. She was reviewing Dan's latest statement when a soft knock at the door broke her focus. Without looking up, she called, "Come in." Dan stepped inside, his posture hesitant, his expression uncertain. He looked more haggard than she had ever seen him, the strain of the past weeks etched deeply into his features. He hovered near the doorway, as though unsure if he was welcome. "What is it, Dan?" Maya asked, her tone neutral as she closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. I wanted to ask you something," he said finally, his voice low. Maya gestured to the chair across from her. "Go ahead." Dan sat down slowly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Do you think any of this will actually make a difference?" he asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "Do you think people will look at this town, at me, and actually believe things can change?" Maya studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "And it doesn't come easy. But this? What we're doing here? It's a start." Dan shook his head, his frustration evident. "A start isn't enough," he said. "Not for the people I've hurt, the lives I've ruined. I don't know if I can ever make up for that." Maya's voice softened, though her tone remained firm. "You can't erase the past, Dan. But you can decide what kind of person you want to be moving forward. That's the choice you have now." Dan looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and hope. "I want to make it right," he said quietly. "I just don't know if I can." "You're the only one who can answer that," Maya replied. "But making it right doesn't mean everyone will forgive you. It doesn't mean you'll get a clean slate. It just means doing the hard work, even when it feels like no one's watching." Dan nodded slowly, her words sinking in. He stood, his movements heavy, and turned toward the door. But before he left, he paused, glancing back at her. "Thanks," he said simply, his voice sincere. Maya nodded in acknowledgement, watching as he left. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. She wanted to believe that Dan's transformation was genuine, but the cynicism born of years in law enforcement tempered her optimism. Still, there was a small part of her that hoped, for his sake and for the sake of the town, that he would prove her wrong. The following day, the precinct was abuzz with tension as federal agents arrived to make arrests. Officers who had once considered themselves untouchable were led away in handcuffs, their expressions ranging from disbelief to defiance. It was a stark reminder that no one was above the law, no matter how deeply rooted their power seemed. Dan watched from a distance, his chest tightening as he recognized faces among those being taken into custody. Men and women he had worked alongside for years, some of whom he had considered friends. He knew he had played a role in their downfall, and the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on him. Maya approached him, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. "It's a lot to take in, isn't it?" she said. Dan nodded, his voice hollow. "I thought I'd feel relieved," he admitted. "But all I feel is empty. Accountability isn't supposed to feel good, Maya said. It's supposed to feel necessary. Dan turned to her, his eyes filled with unspoken questions. Do you think they'll ever forgive me? He asked quietly. The people I've hurt? Maya hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Forgiveness isn't something you can ask for, she said. It's something you have to earn. And even then, it's not guaranteed. All you can do is try to make amends and hope it's enough. Dan nodded, though her words didn't bring the comfort he had hoped for. He knew she was right. Forgiveness wasn't something he was entitled to, it was something he would have to work for, one day at a time. Over the next few weeks, the town of Montrose began to grapple with the fallout of the investigation. News of the arrest spread quickly, sparking outrage, disbelief, and a renewed demand for change. Community leaders held meetings to discuss ways to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the people they served, while federal officials worked to implement reforms within the department. Dan became a reluctant figure in this process, his cooperation with the investigation earning him a complicated mix of gratitude and resentment. Some saw him as a whistleblower, someone who had finally done the right thing. Others viewed him as a traitor, a man who had betrayed his colleagues to save himself. Maya, meanwhile, prepared to move on to her next assignment. Her work in Montrose was nearing its conclusion, but she knew the town's journey toward healing was just beginning. She spent her final days tying up loose ends, ensuring that the reforms being put in place would have a lasting impact. On her last day in town, she found herself standing outside the precinct, watching as the sun set over the horizon. Dan approached her, his expression uncertain. You're leaving, he said, more a statement than a question. Maya nodded. My part here is done, she said. But the real work is just starting, for you and for this town. Dan hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ground. I wanted to say, thank you, he said finally. For not giving up on this, even when it would have been easier to walk away. Maya's expression softened, though her tone remained firm. I didn't do this for you, Dan, she said. I did it for the people who deserved better. Don't forget that. Dan nodded, her words hitting home. I won't, he said quietly. As Maya walked away, Dan stood there, watching until she disappeared from view. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild, to make amends, to be better. It wasn't redemption, not yet. But it was a start. And for now, that was enough. Months had passed since the investigation had shattered the foundations of Montrose's police department. The town, once cloaked in silence and complicity, was now a hive of change and reckoning. The reforms that Maya had helped implement began to take root, though not without resistance. The scars of years of abuse didn't fade easily, and the journey toward healing was slow and uneven. Yet, there was movement, a shift in the air that hinted at something better. Dan Grayson was no longer Sergeant Grayson. His badge, once a symbol of authority and control, was gone, along with the uniform he had worn for over a decade. He had pleaded guilty to charges of misconduct, avoiding a harsher sentence by cooperating fully with the investigation. His time in court had been grueling, every moment a painful reminder of the harm he had caused. But it was also a turning point, a chance to confront the truth of who he had been and who he wanted to become. Dan's sentence included community service, a requirement he initially dreaded but grew to embrace. Working alongside those he had once overlooked or mistreated, he began to understand the depth of the wounds he had inflicted. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he offered apologies where he could, knowing that his words might not be enough. Still, he showed up every day, willing to do the work, to prove that change was possible, even for someone like him. One afternoon, as he painted the walls of a local community center, an older woman approached him. Her name was Mrs. Carter, and she had been one of the voices that had spoken out against the department long before the investigation. Her grandson had been one of Dan's victims, a bright young man whose life had been derailed by an unjust arrest. "You're the one who finally told the truth," Mrs. Carter said, her voice heavy with both judgment and curiosity. Dan stopped painting, lowering his brush as he turned to face her. "I'm trying to make things right," he said quietly. "I know it doesn't erase what I've done, but I'm trying." Mrs. Carter studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good," she said. "But don't just try. Do." Her words stayed with him, a reminder that effort alone wasn't enough. Change required action, consistency, and humility. And for the first time in his life, Dan felt like he was capable of it. Maya, meanwhile, had moved on to another assignment, her focus shifting to a new town, a new case, a new fight for justice. But Montrose had left its mark on her, just as she had left her mark on it. The letters she received from community members, updates about the progress being made, the challenges being faced, were a testament to the impact of her work. She didn't need recognition or accolades, the knowledge that change was happening was enough. One day, while sitting in her office, she received an unexpected email. It was from Dan. The message was brief, but it carried a weight that words couldn't fully capture. "I don't know if you'll ever read this," it began. "But I wanted to say thank you. For pushing me to see what I didn't want to see, and for giving me a chance to do better. I won't waste it." Maya stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a simple reply, "Keep going." In Montrose, the community began to rebuild itself from the ground up. New leadership in the police department brought transparency and accountability, though trust was slow to return. Town meetings were filled with voices that had once been silenced, demanding better for themselves and their neighbors. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One day, during a public forum, Dan stood to speak. The room fell silent as he stepped to the microphone, his presence met with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. He spoke about his journey, his failures, and his commitment to change. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he didn't expect it. But he promised to keep working, to keep learning, to keep trying. And for the first time, the people of Montrose began to see him not as the man he had been, but as someone striving to be better. As the months turned into years, the story of Montrose became one of resilience and transformation. The scars of the past remained, but they were a reminder of what had been overcome. And while the journey was far from over, the town stood as a testament to the power of accountability, courage, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. To those of you watching, this story isn't just about Montrose or Dan or Maya. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make, the systems we uphold or challenge, and the courage it takes to face the truth, even when it's painful. Change doesn't happen in an instant, and it doesn't happen without effort. But it does happen when people are willing to stand up, speak out, and do the work. What would you do if faced with the kind of choices these characters had to make? Would you have the courage to confront your own mistakes, to hold others accountable, to demand better from the systems meant to serve us all? Share your thoughts in the comments below, we'd love to hear from you. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that challenge, inspire, and make us think. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.